The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, coating the shattered village of Bastogne in a deceptive blanket of quiet. At 0600 hours on December 20th, 1944, Captain Henry Caldwell lay face down in a shallow foxhole, the biting cold seeping through every layer of his uniform, gnawing at his bones. The hook of the morning hit him first, a single shrill whistle of a shell tearing through the sky, exploding somewhere beyond the ridge with a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath him. Men screamed, rifles flared, and the battle, already a living nightmare, began anew. Caldwell's breath misted in the freezing air as he raised his binoculars. The forest that had once shielded the Americans now appeared as a skeleton of splintered trunks and jagged branches, stripped bare by artillery fire. Smoke curled from the ruined village, curling into the gray sky like the fingers of some malevolent spirit. Every second was a test of nerves, and the frozen earth beneath him seemed to pulse with tension, as though the ground itself knew the horror unfolding above it. Somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable rumble of German armor grew louder, the sound of steel tracks grinding across snow and frozen mud. The men beside him were pale, huddled together like frightened children. Their hands shook, not only from cold but from the awareness that survival depended on holding a line that had already begun to crack. Caldwell's own hands were clenched tightly around the cold metal of his rifle, knuckles white. He had been in combat before, but nothing compared to this. Surrounded, outnumbered, and with no clear reinforcements in sight. The Ardennes had become a graveyard in miniature, each shell crater a tombstone marking a soldier who had not made it through the night. A sudden flare illuminated the battlefield, casting everything in a ghostly, otherworldly light. Caldwell's eyes darted toward the flash. He saw movement, figures in German gray uniforms advancing cautiously, aware that the Americans had the high ground and artillery behind them. Each step they took was measured, deliberate, as though they, too, felt the weight of the storm around them. Caldwell swallowed hard. Every second counted. Every second could be the difference between life and death, and he knew that hesitation would mean annihilation. The radio in the command post crackled, a voice strained with urgency cutting through the winter air. Caldwell, 38th Cavalry has been overrun. They're falling back to secondary positions. Artillery units are holding barely. Expect contact within the hour. The voice faded into static. Caldwell's stomach tightened. Overrun meant prisoners, or worse. The men he had trained with, fought beside, trusted with his life, were now gone or fighting for every inch of ground they could hold. He raised himself slightly, peering over the edge of the foxhole, and saw Sergeant Miller, one of his oldest companions in the battalion, trying to rally a group of younger soldiers. Their faces were frozen in terror, mouths moving silently, muttering prayers or curses. Caldwell's voice was harsh as he called out orders, cutting through the cold. Hold the line. Don't let them through. Fire only when you're certain. His words were meant to steady not just them but himself, a fragile anchor in the chaos. Shells began falling closer now, the ground erupting in jagged eruptions of snow and mud. Each impact sent shards of frozen earth into the air like shrapnel, a lethal reminder that no position, however fortified, was safe. Caldwell ducked instinctively, the sound of screaming men and the whine of incoming artillery filling his ears. He caught sight of a soldier sprawled across the snow, a red smear stark against the white, and forced himself to look away. There was no time to grieve. The battle demanded every ounce of attention, every fragment of courage. From somewhere behind the line came the low, mournful howl of a wounded soldier, dragging himself toward cover. Caldwell's mind raced. Supplies were low, ammunition was dwindling, and reinforcements were hours, maybe days away. Yet he could not allow despair to take hold. Not now. Not when every man's survival depended on the steel of what they could muster. He gripped the binoculars again, scanning the horizon. Through the haze of smoke and snow, he saw the first glint of German helmets catching the weak winter sunlight. They were closer now, advancing with a deliberate menace, their rifles and machine guns at the ready. Caldwell's heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears louder than the artillery fire. He thought of home, of the letters tucked in his coat, of the small photograph of his sister pinned inside his jacket. There was no time for sentiment, yet the memories spurred him on, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Each man in Bastogne carried something like that, a fragment of life they refused to surrender, a story that could end in the frozen snow unless they held. He glanced around at his men, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. The young private next to him, barely more than a boy, swallowed hard and nodded when Caldwell gave the order to ready rifles. Every man was acutely aware of the stakes. Bastogne was not just a line on a map, it was a symbol. Holding it meant hope, a chance to slow the German advance. Losing it meant a slaughter. The weight of that knowledge pressed down like the cold itself, unyielding and merciless. The first shots rang out from the forward line, sharp cracks echoing across the snow. The German advance slowed, and Caldwell's men returned fire with careful precision. Smoke and snow mixed into a gray haze, visibility dropping to mere yards. He shouted over the din, coordinating his men with quick gestures, his voice hoarse, yet unyielding. Each volley was measured, a desperate attempt to hold the line while buying precious seconds for the artillery units to prepare. Time became a blur of fire, smoke, and fear. Caldwell felt the weight of command in every decision. A hesitation could cost lives, a wrong order could be fatal. Yet, despite the encroaching terror, a strange clarity settled over him. The adrenaline sharpened his senses, and in that chaotic moment, he became a focal point of calm amid the storm. The men around him sensed it too, rallying as one body, one will. As the morning progressed, the snow turned to a relentless wind, whipping across the battlefield and stinging exposed skin. Caldwell adjusted his position, scanning again for movement, for any sign that the Germans might falter, that his men might gain a small victory in the tide of destruction. He knew this was only the beginning of what would become a long, bitter fight. Bastogne's survival depended not on luck, but on courage, on strategy, and on the unbreakable will of those who refused to surrender even in the face of certain death. And so, amidst the screaming shells, the shattered earth, and the bitter cold, Caldwell stayed focused, eyes fixed on the advancing enemy, heart pounding in rhythm with the artillery. Somewhere, beyond the smoke and snow, a single thought anchored him. They might surround them, they might try to break them, but Bastogne would not fall, not today. Lieutenant Samuel Royce moved like a shadow through the shattered streets of Bastogne, his breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. The mission weighed on him like lead. He was to cross enemy lines, deliver the precise coordinates for an artillery strike that could turn the tide, or doom the battalion if he failed. Every step mattered. Every second could be his last. Snow crunched under his boots, masking the soft groans of the wounded soldiers who huddled in the ruined alleys. Broken furniture, mangled vehicles, and the remnants of homes made the village unrecognizable, a ghost town haunted by fire and fear. Royce's eyes darted constantly, scanning for movement. German patrols roamed the streets in cautious sweeps, rifles clutched tightly, boots crunching over ice and debris. He had memorized their likely paths, timed their patrols, but no amount of preparation could erase the primal dread curling in his stomach. A single misstep could be fatal. He pressed himself against the shadow of a wall, heart hammering, as two soldiers passed mere yards away, chatting quietly, oblivious to the American who crouched inches from death. Royce held his breath, every muscle tense, until the patrol disappeared around the corner. Only then did he allow himself to move again. The wind howled through the gaps in ruined buildings, carrying with it the faint, metallic smell of blood and gunpowder. Royce's mind flickered briefly to his family back home, to letters he had hidden in his jacket. There was no time for sentiment now, but he drew a quiet strength from the memory. He had faced danger before, but this was something entirely different. Every shadow could conceal a German soldier. Every sound could signal death. Yet the mission demanded he move forward, regardless of fear. He ducked into a crumbling house, the roof partially collapsed, snow drifting through the gaps like cold fingers. The interior was a tableau of war, shattered tables, broken chairs, and the charred remains of a fireplace. Royce paused to catch his breath, listening. The distant rumble of artillery was a constant reminder that time was slipping away. He checked the coordinates once more, memorizing the numbers, then folded the small piece of paper and tucked it deep into his coat. One mistake, one hesitation, and the artillery might strike their own men. Through the shattered windows, Royce saw movement in the streets below. A lone German soldier paused near a toppled cart, adjusting his rifle. Royce froze, blending into the shadowed interior of the house, body pressed flat against the floor. He could feel the rhythm of his pulse, loud enough that he feared it would betray him. The soldier lingered, then moved on, unaware of the American whose very survival depended on silence. Royce exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he readied himself to move again. Hours passed like this, each moment a careful negotiation between courage and terror. Royce's path took him through a series of alleyways, each more devastated than the last. Snow and ice made every step treacherous, every slip a potential death sentence. Somewhere, a building groaned ominously, a reminder that the destruction of Bastogne was not only from shells but from time and neglect. He had to navigate quickly but cautiously. Patience and timing were now as lethal as any weapon. At one point, he stumbled across a wounded soldier, barely conscious, lying face down in the snow. Royce paused, instinct urging him to help, but logic and duty forced him forward. There was no time. He dragged the image from his mind, focusing instead on the coordinates burning like a beacon in his memory. Lives depended on his success, including those he could not stop to save in that moment. War was cruel in ways that were impossible to anticipate, yet Royce pressed on, carrying the weight of every decision with him. The enemy presence grew stronger as he neared the line. Royce hugged the walls, slipping through narrow passages and crumbling fences, every sense alert. A machine gun rattled somewhere ahead, a staccato burst that sent snow spraying into the air. He froze, pressed against a ruined stone wall, counting the seconds until the patrol moved on. Each heartbeat was a drumbeat of life, each pause a prayer that fate would allow him to continue. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion had begun to gnaw at him. Frostbite tingled in his fingers and toes, and hunger clawed at his stomach, but he could not stop. Not now. Not when the artillery strike he carried in his memory could save the lives of dozens, maybe hundreds. He moved with a mixture of desperation and precision, every movement deliberate, every step a careful negotiation with the possibility of death. The ruined village stretched ahead like a labyrinth designed to test resolve, and Royce navigated it with the determination of a man who knew that failure was not an option. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reached a vantage point overlooking the field where the artillery unit was stationed. Men worked quickly, preparing guns and checking supplies, unaware that the coordinates that could save them were seconds away from being delivered. Royce approached cautiously, ensuring that no enemy soldier had followed him. No shadow lurked where it shouldn't. He handed over the folded paper to the officer in charge, who scanned it quickly, eyes widening at the precision of the calculations. Royce allowed himself a brief exhale, relief washing over him like a sudden, warm current. The artillery guns would fire within minutes, and the German advance could be slowed, giving Caldwell and his men a fighting chance. Yet, even in that fleeting moment, Royce felt the weight of what lay behind him. The destroyed streets, the fallen comrades, the lives he had witnessed lost in silence. War was never kind, never fair, but he had done what was required. For now, that was enough. As he turned to make the perilous journey back, Royce knew the hardest part was not over. The return trip would be just as deadly, if not more. German patrols would be searching for him, and the snow that had once masked his steps would now betray him with every crunch. But the mission was complete, and that small success was a beacon in the encroaching darkness. He moved forward, silent, cautious, determined. Bastogne's survival, and the lives of his comrades, depended on him. The wind whipped across the ruined village once more, scattering snow and debris into the gray sky. Royce pressed on, every sense alert, every heartbeat measured. In the frozen silence between the distant bursts of artillery, he felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. The day was far from over, but he had made a difference. And in a war where hope was scarce, that was a victory in itself. Captain Henry Caldwell crouched over the map in the command post, his eyes tracing the lines and numbers with a precision that masked the turmoil inside him. Every coordinate, every position was a potential life or death decision. The radio crackled intermittently, static and faint voices cutting through the bitter cold that had seeped into the building. Somewhere outside, snow whipped against the windows, mingling with the distant thuds of artillery. The enemy was closing in, relentless, and he knew that a single mistake could annihilate not just his men, but the fragile hope that Bastogne could survive the day. He checked the coordinates again, comparing them to the ones Lieutenant Royce had memorized and delivered. The numbers had to be exact. Too far forward, and the shells would tear through their own lines. Too short, and the German advance would continue unstoppable. Caldwell's fingers traced the paper as if touching it could guarantee success. Every decision was measured, every pause weighted by the knowledge that men were depending on him. Not just strangers, but friends whose lives were woven into his own in the crucible of war. The radio crackled once more. A voice, hurried and anxious, broke through the static. Caldwell coordinates confirmed. Artillery will fire in 5 minutes. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Relief flickered briefly, but there was no time to dwell. The first salvo had to be perfect, and the timing precise. His men outside were exposed, frozen and fatigued, waiting in the snow as if each second could stretch into an eternity. Caldwell rose slowly, the cold biting through his gloves as he moved to the window. He watched the horizon, the tree line that marked the German approach. Through the haze of smoke and falling snow, he could make out the gray shapes of advancing infantry, interspersed with the rumble of armored vehicles. Each movement, each glint of metal in the weak winter sunlight, set his nerves on edge. Yet, amid the fear, there was a clarity, a razor-sharp focus that came only when survival demanded everything of a man. He could hear the faint shouts of his men rallying in the foxholes, the echo of rifles firing sporadically. The snow muffled some of the chaos, but not the sound of fear or resolve. Sergeant Miller, ever steadfast, shouted commands, his voice cutting through the frigid air. Caldwell's eyes met the horizon and the map simultaneously, coordinating every volley, every possible adjustment to the incoming artillery. This was a delicate balance. One wrong move, and the destruction could be indiscriminate. Then the first shells exploded in the distance, a muffled roar that shook the frozen ground and sent snow spiraling into the sky. Caldwell's ears rang, and he felt the vibration travel through his bones. Smoke and debris marked the impact points, and for a fleeting moment, silence fell over the battlefield. It was the kind of pause that made a man aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every possibility. He glanced back at the men in the foxholes through the frosted window. Some had their eyes closed, bracing against the shockwaves. Others had mouths set in grim determination. Survival depended on timing, precision, and courage. The artillery strike began in earnest, a methodical barrage designed to halt the German advance. Caldwell watched as each shell found its mark, snow and earth erupting violently, forcing enemy soldiers to scatter. German armor faltered, slowed by the relentless pounding, while infantry hesitated, uncertain how to navigate the chaotic terrain suddenly transformed into death traps. Caldwell allowed himself the smallest measure of satisfaction. His plan, was working, but the battle was far from over. He picked up the field phone again, voice steady though tension coiled in his chest. Adjust fire to grid 14 to 62. Concentrate on the ridge, watch for armor. The artillery officer acknowledged quickly, and Caldwell could hear the faint hum of activity as the guns shifted, readying for another strike. Outside, the wind tore across the battlefield, carrying the echoes of shouting men and the distant explosions like a haunting symphony. Each impact was a reminder of how close they teetered on the edge between survival and annihilation. The men outside were exposed to both the enemy and the elements. Snow had soaked their clothes, frost biting at every inch of skin, but they fired relentlessly, holding the line inch by inch. Caldwell felt every shot, every movement through the map and radio, as if he were out there with them. Command was never passive. It was a constant, heavy presence that demanded attention, judgment, and the ability to predict the enemy's every move. And yet, despite the weight, there was a strange exhilaration, a clarity born of the knowledge that lives depended on decisions made in this frozen, smoke-filled room. Hours stretched, marked by the steady rhythm of artillery, the sporadic gunfire, and the occasional roar of armored vehicles attempting to push through. Caldwell never left the map. He coordinated, calculated, and adapted, moving with a fluidity born of experience and necessity. Every time he looked out the window, he saw men risking everything, courage burning in their eyes even as exhaustion threatened to claim them. There was no room for doubt. Hesitation could not be afforded. The German advance slowed, but did not stop. Caldwell knew the men outside were holding by mere threads, and his heart clenched at the thought of each life balanced precariously between survival and death. He could see Lieutenant Royce approaching from the ruined streets, weaving through debris with cautious determination. Relief flickered briefly. The courier had returned, successful, and now the artillery strike was fully synchronized with the forward line. That small success was a glimmer of hope in a day defined by fear and chaos. Smoke drifted across the snow, blurring the edges of the battlefield. Men moved like ghosts, shifting between cover, returning fire, and checking on comrades. Caldwell's attention snapped between map, radio, and window, every sense focused, every nerve taut. The artillery fired again, precision strikes scattering the enemy and forcing temporary retreats. He allowed himself a brief glance at the faces of the soldiers outside, and saw that despite their exhaustion and terror, their resolve burned as brightly as ever. They would not yield easily. As evening approached, the light dimming into the gray-blue of winter, Caldwell remained at his post, vigilant. The snowstorm masked movement, aided both friend and foe, and every shadow could conceal danger. He kept coordinating, giving orders, and calculating the next moves, knowing that the men on the field relied on his steady hand, his unyielding judgment. The weight of command pressed down like the cold itself, unforgiving and unrelenting. Caldwell's eyes, tired but sharp, scanned one last time before nightfall. He saw that the enemy had been slowed, that his men had bought precious hours, and that Bastogne's fragile line held. It was not victory, not yet, but it was hope. And in the frozen chaos of Ardennes winter, hope was more powerful than any weapon. The snow had turned thick and heavy by late afternoon, a relentless curtain of white that coated everything in a deceptive calm. Captain Henry Caldwell emerged from the command post, the cold biting through every layer of his uniform, his breath steaming in the air as he scanned the battlefield. From the ridge, he could see the battered remnants of the German advance, slowed by the precision of the morning's artillery strikes. Yet the enemy was still there, regrouping, probing for weaknesses. The fight was far from over. "Hold your positions," Caldwell shouted, voice cutting through the howling wind. His men, frozen and exhausted, clutched their rifles with grim determination. Snow caked their hair and uniforms, frostbitten fingers trembling as they awaited the signal. Every eye on the ridge was fixed on him, every heartbeat synchronized with the tension in the air. Sergeant Miller moved among the foxholes, encouraging the soldiers, steadying the trembling hands of the young privates who had never seen combat like this before. Fear was everywhere, yet courage burned brighter. The first counterattack began as a roar of defiance. A small group of Caldwell's men, led by Lieutenant Royce, surged forward under the cover of smoke and artillery fire. Snow flew in jagged arcs as rifles cracked and machine guns rattled. The Germans, momentarily stunned by the earlier barrage, scrambled to regroup, but the Americans pressed the advantage, forcing them back step by step. Each man fought not only for survival, but for the fragile line of hope that had been carved out by hours of strategic precision. Caldwell watched as the battlefield transformed into a chaotic, almost surreal tableau. Snow-streaked faces, glinting rifles, and the eerie silhouettes of trees shattered by artillery fire created a scene both horrifying and mesmerizing. He could hear the cries of the wounded, the barked orders of officers, and the staccato bursts of gunfire weaving a deadly rhythm across the frozen landscape. The ground itself seemed to shiver under the constant impact of shells, sending plumes of snow and earth into the air like specters rising from the frozen soil. Lieutenant Royce darted between cover and cover, delivering critical updates from the forward line and ensuring that his men held their positions. Every decision he made was a balance of courage and calculation. A single misstep could leave them exposed to machine gun fire or a sudden assault. Despite the danger, Royce moved with the calm precision of a man who understood that hesitation could cost lives. Behind him, the artillery barrage continued to pound the German lines, each shell reinforcing the fragile advantage the Americans had carved out. The Germans, sensing the momentary weakness, launched a desperate assault. Armor rumbled forward, steel tracks grinding over the snow, while infantry followed in a disciplined wave. Caldwell's men held firm, firing with deadly accuracy, using every advantage the terrain offered. Snow-filled foxholes became islands of resistance, and each rifle shot, each burst from the machine gun, slowed the enemy's advance. The clash was brutal, intimate, and immediate, men fighting not as units but as individuals, relying on instinct, training, and sheer determination to survive. Amid the chaos, Caldwell moved among his men, offering orders and reassurance. "Focus fire on the ridge," he shouted, voice hoarse, and saw the effect immediately. A group of advancing Germans faltered under concentrated rifle fire, leaving the snow stained with the cost of defiance. Nearby, Sergeant Miller dragged a wounded soldier to cover, ignoring the flakes of snow mingled with blood. Each act of courage, Each calculated move tipped the delicate balance between survival and defeat. The snowstorm intensified, whipping across the battlefield in sheets, reducing visibility to mere yards. In the frozen haze, men became shadows, movements masked by swirling snow. Caldwell could barely see the enemy, yet he could sense their intentions through the rhythm of the rifle fire and the pattern of artillery impacts. He adjusted coordinates through the radio, each command precise, each adjustment a lifeline to those exposed on the field. Time was both enemy and ally, stretching in agonizing increments as the battle raged. Hours passed like minutes. The counterattack gained momentum as Caldwell's men exploited every lapse in the German assault. Trees shattered by artillery provided unexpected cover, allowing riflemen to fire from protected positions. Snowbanks became improvised barricades, and every frozen trench, every foxhole, was a fortress against the advancing enemy. Men moved with determination, even as exhaustion threatened to collapse their bodies and minds. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of gunpowder, and the bitter tang of fear, but also with resolve, a shared belief that Bastogne could survive. Lieutenant Royce returned to Caldwell's side, breathless but unbroken. "We've slowed them," he shouted over the wind, voice carrying both relief and urgency. "Men are holding, but they're pushing again. Artillery is ready for another strike." Caldwell nodded, acknowledging the report. He knew the fight was not won, but the tide had shifted, if only slightly. Each successful maneuver, each coordinated strike, was a lifeline for the men clinging to survival in the frozen landscape. By late afternoon, the German assault had begun to falter under the relentless counterattacks and precise artillery fire. Snow, blood, and smoke blurred together, creating a surreal landscape of chaos and courage. Caldwell's eyes scanned the battlefield, taking stock of losses and successes. Men were down, some wounded, some silent and still, yet the line held. The counterattack had bought time, carved a fragile victory from the jaws of despair, and for now, Bastogne remained. As evening approached, the wind continued to howl, carrying away the sounds of the retreating enemy and leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Caldwell stood atop the ridge, surveying the battlefield with exhaustion pressing against him like a physical weight. His men, battered and frozen, still held their positions, their eyes reflecting relief, fatigue, and determination. Every moment, every decision had been critical, and every man had contributed to the survival of the line. The snowstorm softened, the violence of the day giving way to a tense, anticipatory quiet. Caldwell allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of the small victory they had achieved. Bastogne had been battered, bloodied, and tested beyond imagination, yet it had survived this wave of the storm. The men had held not by luck, but through courage, coordination, and the unyielding will to fight against overwhelming odds. Caldwell turned his gaze back to the distant tree-line, knowing the night would bring its own challenges. The counterattack had succeeded for now, but the battle was far from over. Every man he saw, every rifleman, every sergeant, carried the hope of survival in their frozen hands. The snow fell steadily, a silent witness to the horrors and heroics of the day, and Bastogne remained, a fragile island of resistance in a storm of destruction. By 2200 hours, the snow had settled into a thick, silent blanket over the battlefield, muffling the remaining sounds of war. Captain Henry Caldwell stood atop a ridge, surveying the battered, frost-covered terrain below. The day had been merciless. Artillery had thundered, rifles had cracked, and men had fallen, some forever, others barely clinging to life. Yet amidst the devastation, a fragile, almost miraculous truth had emerged: Bastogne had survived. The enemy had been slowed, their advance blunted by the courage and precision of the Americans. For now the line held. Caldwell's breath steamed in the freezing air as he scanned the snow-streaked foxholes where his men crouched, exhausted and battered but alive. Each face told a story. Fear and relief mingled with the raw pride of survival. Some stared into the distance, silent and solemn, processing the day's horrors. Others whispered quietly to comrades, the camaraderie of shared struggle offering a fragile comfort against the enormity of what had occurred. The battlefield was littered with the remnants of destruction. Broken vehicles, shattered trees, craters filled with snow, and the occasional figure of a fallen soldier, stark against the frozen ground. Lieutenant Samuel Royce approached cautiously, boots crunching over snow and debris. His face was pale, frostbitten, yet determined. He carried with him the knowledge that the mission he had undertaken earlier in the day had been a success. The artillery coordinates he delivered had allowed the counterattack to gain momentum, turning the tide in this brutal, frozen corner of Belgium. He met Caldwell's gaze with a weary nod. There was unspoken understanding between them. The weight of command and duty had been carried, and the price had been enormous. Caldwell's eyes returned to the horizon. Somewhere beyond the distant tree-line, shadows moved. The remnants of a German patrol retreating in the dark, cautious and battered. He knew it was temporary. The enemy would regroup and probe again, testing defenses wherever weakness appeared. Yet for this night, at least, Bastogne remained intact. Relief and exhaustion collided inside him, a storm of emotions that left him hollow yet resolute. His men had held against overwhelming odds, and that fact alone would echo in their memories forever. The snowstorm, which had raged all day, now softened into a gentle, almost deceptive calm. Caldwell took in the quiet, aware that in war, silence could be as dangerous as gunfire. Yet in this moment, it offered a brief reprieve, a chance to measure the cost of survival. He glanced at the radio, static-filled and patient, waiting for that one sign that could confirm what they all yearned to hear: the arrival of reinforcements. Minutes stretched into eternity as he clutched the receiver, listening to the distant crackle of static that carried both hope and uncertainty. Then, through the hiss and hum, a single unmistakable voice broke through. "All units, hold your positions. Reinforcements are on the way." Over. The words, though simple, carried immense weight. Caldwell exhaled slowly, relief washing over him like a tide breaking against the frozen battlefield. A quiet cheer rippled among the soldiers in the foxholes, tentative but real, a sound that spoke of survival, resilience, and the unyielding human will to endure. Some raised their rifles in salute. Others simply stared into the darkness, processing the day's events with quiet reverence. Caldwell moved among his men, offering words of encouragement and acknowledgement. He saw the young private who had been terrified that morning now standing a little taller, eyes reflecting both exhaustion and the embers of newfound courage. He noticed Sergeant Miller, battered but unbroken, helping a wounded soldier to a makeshift shelter. Every act, every gesture, told the story of a line held not by chance, but by the collective bravery and sacrifice of men who refused to surrender, even when the odds were insurmountable. In the fading light, Caldwell allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The battlefield was a mosaic of human endurance and suffering. Craters from artillery, blood-streaked snow, shattered vehicles, and the scattered remnants of equipment marked the horrors endured. Yet within the devastation was proof of resilience. Bastogne had been tested, and while the cost had been high, it had endured. The line held because of courage, strategy, and the unbreakable will of men who had stared death in the face and refused to yield. Royce approached again, reporting the status of the forward line and the remaining artillery positions. His voice, though weary, carried a quiet pride. Together, they surveyed the battlefield, noting the positions secured, the men still holding, and the areas where losses had been suffered. The snow, though calm now, bore witness to the violence and heroism that had defined the day. Each crater, each frozen figure, was a testament to the human capacity to fight, endure, and survive against unimaginable odds. Caldwell's thoughts drifted to those who would not see another day. Friends, comrades, and soldiers who had given everything for the line. Their sacrifice hung in the air, heavy yet sacred, and he bowed his head briefly in silent acknowledgement. War demanded courage, yes, but it also demanded acknowledgement of loss, a recognition of the cost embedded in every victory. Bastogne's survival was their victory, but it was purchased with the highest price. As darkness deepened, the wind softened, carrying with it the distant sounds of preparation. Reinforcements would arrive soon, and the men would have a chance to rest, to recover, however briefly. Caldwell looked once more across the battlefield, eyes scanning every foxhole, every frozen soldier, every scarred tree. For now, Bastogne had endured, and the men who remained were a testament to the strength of human will. Finally, Caldwell allowed himself a long, steady breath. The storm had passed for the moment. He knew that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own trials, but tonight there was a fragile, hard-won peace. Bastogne had survived because men refused to break, because strategy had been executed with precision, and because courage had burned brighter than fear. And in that bitter, frozen Ardennes night, hope glimmered, a rare, precious flame in a world of snow, smoke, and sacrifice.